Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to TBR's webinar, The Pros and Cons of Threat Intelligence Sharing with TBR Senior Analyst, Jane Wright. I'm Justin Surgent, and I'll be hosting today's session. Threat intelligence is increasingly being shared by and among security vendors, but what value do vendors really derive from such generosity? Today we'll be talking about the impact for security vendors that join threat sharing associations. This webinar will take a look at some key threat associations, including which vendors belong to each one and what they are doing today. We'll look at the pros and cons for vendors that opt to stay out of threat sharing communities and just use their own intelligence for their customers and paid subscribers. Now, before we begin today's presentation, there are a few housekeeping items I'd like to cover. First, we'll be recording today's session and posting it on our YouTube site, TBRI channel. I encourage you to visit that channel and watch our previous presentations. I will send the link of through the chat function during the webinar. Second, we'd like to hear your thoughts and opinions on the material we're presenting today. Please send any questions you have through the Q&A function, and we will address as many as we can at the end of the presentation. And finally, I will be following up with all of you within 24 hours with the slides from today's webinar, as well as the link to our YouTube recording, so please be on the lookout for that in your email tomorrow afternoon. Now let me introduce our presenter today. Jane Wright is a senior analyst leading TBR's security coverage. Jane and her team help security vendors, security service providers, and other clients achieve their business objectives in the security market. The team delivered TBR's Enterprise Security Benchmark, Enterprise Security Market Forecast, and research into customer spending, adoption, satisfaction, and confidence in security products and services. And with that, let me hand this over to Jane.
Thank you, Justin, and welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Let's take a look at our agenda for this afternoon. Today, we'll be doing an overview of threat intelligence sharing associations, focusing in particular on associations that are made up of vendor members, security vendors, and security service providers. We'll look at the pros and cons of becoming a member and being active in these associations. We'll also touch on the customer's perspective. How do they feel when their vendors do or do not become actively involved in some of these associations? We'll wrap up with me giving you some recommendations about my perspective on these associations and their value. And we'll take a quick look at what I believe is the future of these threat sharing associations. And before I begin, I just want to tell you where my information came from. To prepare for this webinar, I spoke to 10 representatives of security vendors to ask about their involvement in threat sharing associations. Of the 10 I spoke to, 7 were quite active as representatives of their vendors in threat sharing associations. So 7 were, but 3 were not. 3 represented vendors who generally do not become actively involved in these associations. So from that I got both perspectives, the reasons why some joined and the reasons why others didn't. And then I'll even mention that a couple of folks then, after speaking to me as representative of their vendor, of their association, they actually said, now let me go off the record. And they gave me a little bit more insight, which I can share with you on an aggregated and anonymized fashion. So that's where most of my information came from. And also, though, I did speak to many end-user customers, business security customers, to ask them their thoughts on vendors' involvement in threat sharing associations. And that's what's going to form the basis of my conversation today. Okay, let's get into it and talk about the key themes that will resonate throughout our webinar. Making the choice and getting involved in a threat sharing association is a major commitment. It does require a great deal of time and resources and other factors from security vendors and security service providers. And I realize I should pause at this moment and just define what I mean when I'm saying threat sharing association. Today we're looking at groups of security vendors and security service providers who have chosen to come together and create a formal agreement amongst themselves to share their threat intelligence with each other. So these are vendors who have opted to be sure to send things like malware signatures, hashes, site reputations, hacker profiles, and other information that they've been collecting from mostly their customer install bases. from scans of their customers' network security devices or their customers' AV endpoints or what have you. These are groups of vendors that have come together and made this agreement that they will share with each other. They generally then will put out a press release, they'll give themselves a name, and they will enter into a formal agreement. Those are the types of threat sharing associations that I mostly mean when I'm speaking to you today, although there'll be some exceptions, and I'll mention those. Okay, so it does require a great deal of resource commitment. Each association has a certain amount of requirements, so you can't just join and then sit back. There are things that vendors need to do to participate, and we'll look at what those are. But also, it requires a commitment of trust. And it's so ironic because this is a particularly untrusting market, for obvious reasons, the security marketplace. But it does require trust in an untrusting market. And so because of that, we will see that many vendors, in addition to or in place of joining formal threat sharing associations, they also nurture very informal relationships that are very fluid. Well, no, excuse me, some are long-term, but they're very informal relationships, one-on-one, from one vendor to another or to a service provider or what have you. So we'll take a look at that. And what we'll find as we're talking is that it's a best practice for vendors and service providers to continually reassess what are the associations out there, who's belonging, what are they doing, because we'll see some of the things that have been happening and see why we need to always be reassessing our involvement and perhaps becoming more or less involved in certain associations as time goes on. A key thing to keep in mind as we're talking about these threat sharing associations is that across the board, everyone I spoke to said that, and I believe, that their involvement is not necessarily for monetary gain or a market share gain or to impress customers or anything like that. Truly, each of these threat sharing associations has come together for the greater good. They are helping strengthen each other's defenses to help combat the black hat community. As someone in one of my in-depth conversations with a vendor said, it reminded him of the quote, which I believe is attributed to John F. Kennedy, "A rising tide lifts all boats." So on this slide number 5, the ocean represents the entire community of security vendors and service providers and their customers, and the boats represent the different vendors. And they come together for a portion of every day. They stop competing and work together for the greater good of all. Now I'm going to just touch on a few threat sharing association examples just to get our mindset on the scope and age and things of some of the ones out there. Oh, no, I apologize. I had another slide first. First here on slide number 6, I want to just mention the different types of threat sharing associations. There are the formal associations that are driven by many vendors, so there'll often be many co-founders, and the vendors are fairly equal to each other in terms of driving the direction of the association. There are other formal associations that are driven by a single vendor, and we'll look at some of those. Then there are those informal trust relationships that I mentioned to you. And then we don't want to forget that, of course, there are other associations that involve customers too, such as the ISACs. And then there are a number of organic relationships that arise and fall depending on circumstances. They could involve vendors, customers, the government. They tend to rise up around a particular threat or a particular actor, a threat actor group. They'll remain very active when it's important, and then as they begin to achieve their purpose, that group will begin to become less active and eventually kind of dissolve. So those are the different types of associations. You know, the vendors I spoke to, I asked them, where are you getting all your data, from your associations or what else? And they said, well, generally, we're collecting most of our information internally. We are scanning our own customers' our own install bases, and we're collecting that data, and then we're applying our own security expert research, and that makes up the most of our threat intelligence that we are using. On average, 75%. I was hearing quotes ranging from 60 to 80%, but mostly folks were saying about 75%, we generate it internally. But the other 25%, we are collecting from hundreds of data sources. A lot of these data sources were free. They were threat feeds from, say, the government or other sources, and then some of these sources are from their threat sharing associations. And when you look at this, it might make you say, well, gee, that's a lot of work, a lot of relationships and associations to manage to just bump up your threat intelligence by another 25%. But in all honesty, what I heard as I spoke to vendors is that 75% that everyone is generating internally tends to be kind of similar from one vendor to another. I mean, it varies depending on if their customer base is very involved in a certain vertical or a certain geography, but they tend to be seeing generally the same kinds of things going on. And it's bringing in that extra 25% that's giving each vendor their own particular mix that works best for them, that they can then pull together with analytics and other kinds of analysis and research that they're doing that just sets the vendor apart. And so the conclusion I really came to is, yes, it's a lot of work for 25%, but it really does boost each vendor's own insights and ability to support their own customers. Okay, now I'm going to go on to those three examples that I said. I'm just going to touch on some examples of formal threat sharing associations that consist of vendor and service providers. First one I wanted to mention is the Cyber Threat Alliance, or CTA. This is a fairly new one, just kind of got going about, a little under a year ago. And you can see the members here on slide number 7. Basically, they have a number of requirements, but pretty much each member must submit 1,000 fresh malware samples per day, meaning 1,000 items that haven't been seen in the last 24 hours. And this association or alliance is really getting going now. And the main thing that helped a lot, I believe, was that they did come to an agreement to standardize on certain protocols and standards, and that was particularly STIX and TAXI. And they have begun sharing data between each other. So that one's getting going. Another example I decided to show you was WebRoot's Wright Cloud. This is an example of a formal agreement that's really led by one vendor, but the other vendors know who belongs and are very aware of each other. And I like to show this one because it's a very extensive example of what a vendor can do to pull together a lot of other members who every other part of the day they're competitors, or many other parts of the day, but really pull together a big group, and you can just see how this can provide a great deal of value because there are so many different insights coming in from such a diversity of different members. But I do want to say that there are many other vendors that drive communities of other associations, other members, and so I don't mean to slight them, and so I'm thinking of folks like FireEye at this point. But I liked WebRoot's example because it was so diverse. Finally, I want to give you an example from the defense industry, and that is Lockheed Martin's Cybersecurity Alliance, or CSA. And this one's a little bit unique because members agree not only to collaborate and share intelligence and receive intelligence, but they also agree to participate in a degree of security experiments, too. And the motivation here is, as always, for the greater good, but to help support our national defense in America. I'm just pausing to read a question that came in case I need to answer it right away, in case someone's having a concern. So I will mention that I am speaking today primarily about threat sharing associations of only vendor members. There are other associations of vendors and customers, such as the ISACs, or Information Sharing and Analysis Centers. But in order to get done in our time today, I did want to just focus on vendor and service provider only member associations. Okay, just wanted to clarify that to help our audience follow along as best as they can. Let's touch again, though, back on those informal relationships. Vendors I spoke to, whether or not they were involved in formal associations, pretty much everyone has a number of informal relationships going on too. And this really surprised me with how active it is. There's a lot of phone calls going on between vendors and service providers. And a lot of times what happened is two people used to work together at the same vendor. They formed a relationship, built up a level of trust between themselves, and now one has gone on to work somewhere else, but that trust relationship remains. And so when they see a particular threat or action beginning to occur, or just an indicator or trend, they'll call up their old buddy and tell them. And this was very heartening to me. I mean, I'm really glad this is happening, because you can be sure the Black Hats are also informally helping each other out. So we need to do that as much as we can too, and put aside our differences when we feel that it's helpful to tell other vendors what we're seeing, what's going on. And in these cases, unlike the formal associations, this is not a matter of formal requirements or anything like that. There's no fees being exchanged, although someone mentioned it's beer equity. I buy them a beer at the next RSA conference, you know. But basically it's just based on, I'm going to call you up and tell you because I know you'll reciprocate and call me and tell me when I need it. And this is very important. It's a very important part of any vendor's strategy. And so even though it's informal, I feel it really needs to be nurtured and treated as a formal resource for vendors to remain very well involved in the threat environment. Now I'm going to get into the pros and cons, which are the kind of the basis of my presentation to you today. So first we'll look at the pros and cons of formal associations of vendors and service providers sharing intelligence. And then after this we'll look at the pros and cons of the informal relationships. So the formal associations. You know, the first few pros that I'm showing here with plus signs, they are what you might expect, the good things that we'd all imagine. For example, all of the security data that's gathered can be implemented for the greater good of every vendor, every member's customer base. And that is really happening. Most members really are leveraging the intelligence they receive, and that is improving their ability to help their customers detect and respond to threats. A number of vendors also, though, told me that what they're finding is the structure of the formal association has really helped speed things up for them. So, for example, there's an agreement in place, and it either says, this is who's going to email a feed to so-and-so, or this is who's going to store in a central repository and everyone else is going to grab from it, or whatever it might be. But the structure, the format, the timing is put in place and agreed upon. And because of that, I found it really did help vendors react and respond more quickly for their customers. Another benefit is that vendors bring different members bring different skills. So not every vendor can afford to put a linguist in their security research staff or a behavioral psychologist in their research staff. But having those skills helps, and so belonging to an association gets you a greater diversity of skills that helps you understand threats even a little bit better. But the final plus sign is one I really want to emphasize for you here. The key about these formal associations, in my opinion, is this. Right now, the security market is exploding with vendors and service providers. It is growing. There's dozens and dozens of viable security vendors and hundreds of security startups that are going to be viable for a couple of years at least coming into the market. It's growing. It is not shrinking right now. But that's going to change. This will not continue beyond a couple more years. Then the market's going to start to consolidate. And when that does, vendors are going to look to each other to talk about merger and acquisition ideas, possibilities, or more formal partnerships that go to the level of a federation. I believe that vendors who are involved in these formal threat sharing associations will be the ones that are beginning already to form these bonds, to become involved in the M&A discussions, to become a member of these federated alliances, If a vendor is not involved in a formal threat sharing association, and it's a fairly influential one, then that vendor or service provider might get left out, might just be disregarded or overlooked when the market does begin to consolidate to fewer members later. So it's very important to join these alliances for the reason of being in the right place, being the party when the party begins to break up and people begin to form groups, and that will happen. But there are some cons. There are some cons to joining these threat sharing associations, and the main one is human nature. A lot of people I talked to off the records told me some things that had them pretty riled up about times when, for example, they felt that they discovered something and yet someone else got first attribution on it. And there's also liability concerns. People worry, well, if I share this to another member and that vendor's customer gets breached, will I somehow be held responsible that I didn't put enough insight around or something like that? So there's just these human nature worries that members have when they join these larger formal associations. And all I can say about that is it's just a matter of just constant maturity and communication between members. It's something that's always just going to take a level of maturity and a level of communication. There are also some technical obstacles around vulnerability and scalability. So the vulnerability is vendors get hacked. They do. And if you're in an association and you're all kind of putting your threat data into a centralized place, maybe not all of it is, but there's some degree of centralization, that can get hacked. And then we basically tip our hand to the attackers. And then there is the concern as associations grow bigger and bigger and bigger, can the members consume and absorb everything they're getting? Do they have the scalability? Or is there a place that it can be centrally located? Does anyone have the bandwidth and the capacity to hold it for everyone else? So those are those technical concerns that kind of restrict it eventually from growing as much as it might have. But there is that concern, though, the final concern, the last minus sign that you see here on slide 11. Associations can reveal too much to the black hats. So here's what I'm getting at there. Sometimes a vendor may discover something going on, kind of see that something looks suspicious, become concerned, begin to investigate it. In some circumstances, that vendor may choose, even after they see that the malware is in, the hacker's in, they may choose to let it go for a little bit because they'd rather wait and watch and see what the hacker does and learn more about that hacker, because long term, finding that out is going to be more beneficial than shutting this thing down right this second. And so a vendor working alone might make that decision. But if there's an agreement to share, the vendor may feel, the member of an association may feel compelled to share the information to the other members. Another vendor may look at it and say, yeah, I don't want to wait. I know you're investigating, but I got to shut this down immediately. And they will go ahead and shut something down, block or quarantine a hacker or a malware. By doing that, we're showing the black hats, the hackers, the cyber criminals, we're showing them maybe earlier than we want to about what we know of what they're doing and how we're responding to it. So sometimes that can be a problem of the formal threat sharing associations. So those are the pros and cons, and I'll kind of summarize those and kind of tell you where I think the seesaw tips on this when I get to the end. But let's go ahead now and look at the pros and cons of those informal relationships, one buddy calling up another at another vendor or service provider. So kind of in many ways it's the flip side of what I just told you. So first off, vendors told me that they usually rely on this secrecy that they have when they're just calling up one buddy at another vendor or another security service provider. They say, you know, but please don't do anything yet. I don't want to tip my hand to this particular threat actor group. And when it's just an informal relationship, the other person will generally be able to be, you know, a little bit more constrained and will hold back and allow that investigation to proceed. And sometimes that is something that will be desired by the FBI or Homeland Security too. So sometimes those informal relationships are the right approach in certain investigations. Another good thing about the informal relationships is it can help allay or diminish customers' concerns about their anonymity. Rather than going into this right now, the whole next slide is about customer perspective, so I'll get back to this in a second. But let's just go on quickly to the negatives about the limitations of the informal buddy-calling-buddy relationships. First off, because it's not formalized and there are not agreements assigned and documented, these relationships may not be as vetted. And yes, this person that you're calling was a great friend, someone you trusted, but you never know that maybe something's gone bad at their company and they've got a beef with their employer now, and you know, that does raise a little bit of a risk that needs to be constantly kind of check in with the relationship and see how that person's doing and how they're doing in their employer, in their job, make sure things are still going evenly and smoothly. And finally, important developments or correlations about certain threat indicators can get missed in a smaller informal relationship. The bigger formal associations, they do cast a wide net, so they tend to see pretty much everything. And so in an informal relationship, you can almost be a little bit insular or isolated in just seeing what you and a couple of buddies are seeing. And so you could miss out on a particular factor that could determine a different reaction or response to an attack. Let's go ahead and look at what customers think of all this. So I talked to customers and I said, how do you feel when your vendor or your service provider tells you that they've joined the Cyber Threat Alliance or the Cybersecurity Alliance or any of those associations? And by and large, first off, a lot of customers weren't aware of it. They didn't know. They said, oh, really? I didn't know. My vendor's belonging to that? Okay, that's interesting. But then once they thought about it and they realized, yeah, you know, I guess that makes sense. I can see my vendor is sharing my intelligence, my data for intelligence with other members in their associations. They thought about it and they told me, well, for me that's good and bad. The good news is customers do recognize that this is for the greater good of all. If they let their security data, you know, the log files from their firewalls, the scan data from their antivirus, the login attempts being collected from their IAM, anything like that, they do know that if they let it go up to their vendor's cloud or wherever it might be, and then their vendor shares it into their association, customers respect that that's for the greater good of all, and it will help my industry, it'll help raise the tide to lift all boats. They recognize, think that's good, I like it. But then human nature kicks in, and they said, well, you know, I wish my vendor could share everyone's data except mine, just not mine. I want to keep mine out of it. Because they said, even though my vendor is assuring me about anonymity and aggregation and encryption of my data and everything like that, they say, you know, the truth is still and all, I feel like my data is at risk. And my vulnerabilities, therefore, could be exposed to a greater number of hackers and black hats. You know, vendors get hacked. We saw some this year. I won't name them, don't need to call them out, but they do. And then if vendors get hacked, well, associations can get hacked too. And customers realize that, it makes them nervous. So customers see the pros and the cons of their vendors getting involved. But here's the good news about it. The way the customers think about it is they recognize all the vendors are kind of getting the same ingredients. All that security data, it's the same ingredients. It's the sugar, it's the flour, it's the butter. But it's what the vendors are doing with it that makes the difference. They really do recognize that that's differentiated. The data itself, it doesn't mean a whole lot till my vendor, my service provider, puts it together, cooks it, bakes it, and is a better chef. And if I believe my vendor's a better chef, then that's what I'm differentiating my vendor on. That's where I'm looking and deciding if I think this vendor is more valuable to me than others I may have chosen. So that's pretty good overall. That's the perspective that vendors have. Let me bring you to my recommendations, because I've given you pros and cons, and it's like a seesaw, and you might be thinking, well, Jane, where do you come down on all this? And here's what I think. First off, I think every vendor and every service provider needs to assess their own particular set of customers to determine just how willing is your customer to be sharing data, because you're going to share it further into an association. And what happens is it tends to depend on where most of your customers fall into certain verticals. So, for example, I found that most financial customers, they're all for it. That, yeah, share my data, share it out to associations. I'm good. I recognize that. I need the financial industry to remain strong, and so I am happy about this sharing. But other customers, like, say, biomedical, they are less inclined, and they really want their vendor to keep their data a little more isolated. So you just want to take the temperature of your customer base and use that as you move forward with your decisions to become either very active and join lots of associations, or maybe kind of keep it a little bit more limited in scope. But whatever you do, I think you've got to join one major association. One association that's pretty active today, has some key players in it that are maybe very different from you, to bring that different perspective. I think it's important to at least join one. And, you know, it is for all the motherhood and apple pie reasons that I talked about. But it's also because, as I said, you want to be at the party when the party starts to break up. You need to be in that association, and you need to, frankly, be leading committees or other ways being very active so that you are aware of and brought to mind as vendors, other vendors begin to form federated alliances or even mergers or investments in each other, as some vendors are doing more and more these days. You need to be at the party, and that's a key reason for putting in the time and resources to join the formal threat associations. But whatever you do, though, don't place all your bets on the association. Place your bets on the standards that they're following. I believe the market has really settled on STIX and TAXII and a couple of others, but mainly it's that. STIX and TAXII, as you know, are the protocols, the standards that were originally kind of driven by MITRE to enable a common way to share threat information between different different recipients, let's just say. It's become so widely accepted that it's now been, MITRE has moved it off to a nonprofit group called OASIS, and that's a key indicator that it is really become the de facto standard. I believe STIX and TAXII are in place for 5 years, at least. And so your association may come, your association may go, but make sure that you are choosing to stay with ones that are following STIX and TAXII and that you are working within those standards also. But for all that discussion of standards and formal associations, do not neglect to still have a good handful at least of those other informal relationships, other people that you trust to call one-on-one, or maybe it's like a phone tree, you call the next person who calls the next person, but some degree of that informal relationships, those informal relationships, because those are going to fill those unusual little gaps that you need in your visibility. And they require some time to go to the conferences, to meet up with the people, to have a lunch, whatever it may be. It's worth the investment to keep those informal relationships strong. My final slide is a look at the future of threat sharing associations. Today, the associations that I spoke to, where I spoke to representatives, they're all fairly democratic. Pretty much anyone can join, so long as you meet the requirements. And the requirements are pretty basic and they're well publicized, and you apply and you're probably going to be accepted and you're probably going to be invited into the party. And they're very democratic. Everyone's pretty much getting access to the same data. But you know what? That's not going to remain the case. My personal opinion is that, or TBR's opinion is that over time they're going to become sub-classifications, sub-levels of sharing within the associations. There might already be even a little bit, truthfully, and it's just going to happen more, where some members get everything and other members get this set or that set of data or in a certain time frame compared to others. they're going to become less democratic. And there'll be reasons. For example, something will happen, a breach will occur that will cause an association to decide to handle things a little differently in the future. But whatever drives it, just know it's going to become less democratic. And so that's just another reason why you want to be actively involved, heading committees, what have you, so that you are aware and keeping your company at the highest level of information sharing and knowledge of what's going on within the association. And as I've touched on, the associations, you can look at any one today and say, oh, this is an important one because it's got big key vendors in it who have a lot of market share, or because they were the last ones to really have great insights into this major attack that we saw. So today, one association might be considered the really best one to be involved, but next year it could be someone else. Could just as easily be another association because things change in the market. And so you just want to keep on looking at the different associations, take a little roll call for yourself, who's in it, what have they been doing, and reassessing how active you want to be in each one. That's my planned presentation today. I want to go on now and let you have an opportunity to ask questions.
All right, just a reminder, please send any of your questions to the Q&A function. And with that, let's begin. So the first question, which vendors are going to have the most influence over the way other vendors share threat intelligence in the future?
That is really hard to predict. Any association can be brought down by a particular threat, as I mentioned. I will say that I think that the 4 founders of the Cyber Threat Alliance, it was Palo Alto Networks, Fortinet, Symantec, and McAfee. That was a really smart move, I believe, for them to come together and start up that alliance. So I think that's going to be very influential for the foreseeable future, and I think those 4 vendors in particular and their other members are going to have a lot of influence over the way the market as a whole reacts to threats in the future. But as I mentioned, people will merge, different threats will be reacted to in different ways, and so again, it's just the influence is going to be all around the standards, the STIX and the TAXII standards followers.
So second question, what, if anything, can vendors do to get customers to opt in to more data sharing?
Oh, okay. So this questioner is asking where I mentioned that some customers don't really want their vendors collecting too much of their security log data or other data and then certainly sharing it with others even further. What do you do if you've got a lot of customers who are opting out of that and you would like to increase your telemetry by getting more customers to opt in and allow that to happen? So here's what I think would be really important. Certainly you talk to the customer about how you've anonymized their data and aggregated their data so that it is not directly identifiable to them. And that really is true, but the question is, do they trust that? I actually think it really comes down to the customer eventually either has trust in your brand or not. So they look at your brand, the name of your company, the name of your service provider organization, and their board feels a level of trust or doesn't. And that's just going to be key to how much they're going to opt in. So it's a matter of building that whole that feeling of trust and confidence in your brand overall, and then that feeling of trust and confidence will percolate into their sharing and opting in of sharing data. And then it is kind of helpful to give customers a degree of control over what they do and do not share. I mean, I know you already do, but even more so, making sure customers can say, well, from these devices I will share and these devices I won't, or in this particular one of our branch offices, they're doing something particularly confidential, so I don't want any opt-in of security data sharing from that office or anything like that. It's a little bit more cumbersome for you to organize, but that does help customers feel a lot more confidence. Okay, we're just checking to see if we have any more questions now. Just give us just a little bit more time to take the questions that are coming in. Okay, so I'll actually read off this question, Justin, because I just had to read it a little bit to kind of understand what they were asking. So this person is saying, as more customers, especially enterprise customers, move their security to the cloud, so this might be hosted security services or managed security services, wouldn't this lead to a new kind of needs, thus new associations and new subgroups? That is a very good observation from this particular person. That is true. So, you know, a lot of the threat sharing that's happening today is because the members are collecting from on-premise devices. And, you know, your ability to join, your ability to be active almost is a measure of, well, how many devices do you have out in customer sites? You got millions of endpoints on customers' PCs, and you've got thousands and thousands and thousands of firewalls and IPSs, and your customers have them in their own infrastructure. That's what you're sending. But so that will change. And yes, I think that's a very good observation that associations may skew or change their requirements or change their specialization to particularly to help the greater good of cloud-based security service customers. Let's see. I think that's it. There are a couple of questions that I don't have the answers to right now. So for those questioners, I will get back to you privately via email because it will just take me a little bit of research to get back to you. But other than that, I think that's it for the questions we will be able to answer at this point. Yeah, that's it.
All right, so yeah, that's all we have. So thank you, Jane, and thank you everyone for your questions. And as Jane mentioned, we'll follow up with you for some of those questions we weren't able to get to. You can follow Jane as well as TBR on Twitter at the handles listed here, and please check out our pages on SlideShare and YouTube to view our previously aired presentations. Now, before you sign off, I'd like to ask you to take a very brief survey about today's webinar. We're always looking to improve both the information we provide and how we provide it to you. And, you know, we do look at that feedback, so please leave comments. So, yeah, we'll leave the chat function open for another minute or so if people ask last-minute questions. Otherwise, thanks for attending, and have a great afternoon.